Before she created a monster, Mary Shelley was trapped in a monstrous love affair. This is the story of how a teenage runaway, her married lover, and her own stepsister, who was also in love with him, gave birth to one of the greatest horror stories of all time. It's a tale of radical ideas, scandalous romance, and profound tragedy. Because to understand where the monster came from, you have to understand the chaotic, interwoven lives of his creators. This isn't just the story of a book, it's the story of how pain, passion, and jealousy sparked a nightmare that has haunted us for over 2 centuries. Our story doesn't start with a bolt of lightning, but in a house overflowing with dangerous ideas. Mary Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin in London in 1797, and her very existence was an act of rebellion. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering feminist author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She was a thinker so far ahead of her time she was famously slammed as a hyena in petticoats. Wollstonecraft argued that women weren't inferior to men. They were just held back by a lack of education, a radical idea back then. She lived her philosophy, having affairs and a child, Fanny Imlay, out of wedlock. Mary's father was William Godwin, a leading political philosopher and basically the father of modern anarchism. His book, An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, argued against institutions like government, religion, and even marriage, which he saw as forms of tyranny. So yeah, not your typical parents. They believed in reason, liberty, and tearing down convention. But their radical paradise didn't last. Just 11 days after giving birth to Mary, Mary Wollstonecraft died from an infection. Mary Shelley would never know her mother, but she would grow up in her shadow, reading her books and venerating her memory. She inherited her mother's fiercely independent spirit, a trait that would define her entire life. William Godwin, devastated, was left to raise Mary and her half-sister Fanny. He gave Mary a rich, if unconventional education, encouraging her to read everything and think for herself. The Godwin household was a magnet for the great minds of the day. Can you imagine being a kid and having Samuel Taylor Coleridge recite The Rime of the Ancient Mariner in your living room? Or seeing scientists who were pioneering wild experiments with the mysterious new force of electricity dropping by for dinner? This was Mary's world, a whirlwind of poetry, science, and radical philosophy. But the home was also a mess. Godwin, the man who wrote against marriage, remarried a woman named Mary Clairmont, who brought her own 2 children, Charles and Claire, into the house. Mary and her stepmother did not get along, and the home was constantly tense and broke. Mary found her escape in her mother's memory, often stealing away to the St. Pancras churchyard to read at her mother's grave. It was her sanctuary. And it was there, in the shadow of her mother's tomb, that her own life would take a dramatic and scandalous turn. Because it was there she would fall in love. In 1814, a charismatic and brilliant young poet started visiting the Godwin home. His name was Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was a huge fan of William Godwin's work, a fellow atheist and radical who wanted to burn the old world down. He was also handsome, intense, and, most inconveniently, already married with a child on the way. Percy was 5 years older than Mary, who was just 16. He was a rebellious aristocrat, already kicked out of Oxford for writing a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. He saw marriage as a kind of tyranny, a selfish monopoly that went against true love, which he believed should be totally free. This was Percy's free love philosophy, and he would try to live by it, often with devastating consequences for the women in his life. Mary, who had been raised on these exact ideas, was completely captivated. She saw Percy as the living embodiment of her parents' philosophies. They started meeting in secret at her mother's grave, and it was right there that they declared their love. For Mary, this wasn't just a teenage crush. It was a philosophical statement, her claim to the legacy of freedom her mother had championed. But when her father, the great anarchist William Godwin, found out, he was furious. The man who wrote against the shackles of marriage couldn't stand his daughter running off with a married man. He forbade them from seeing each other. But it was too late. On July 28, 1814, Mary and Percy ran away. And they didn't go alone. They took Mary's stepsister, the lively, attention-seeking 16-year-old Claire Clairmont. Claire, who had her own complicated crush on Percy, was the enthusiastic third wheel on this romantic rebellion. Their elopement was a massive scandal. Mary was disowned by her father, who refused to even see her for over 2 years. The trio traveled through a war-torn France, reading, writing, and keeping a joint journal, pretending they were characters in a romance novel. The reality, however, was anything but romantic. They quickly ran out of money and had to crawl back to England, where they were social outcasts, drowning in debt. And now, Mary was pregnant. They were pariahs, shunned for their flagrant disregard for the rules. Their little experiment in free love had cast them into a deep isolation, an isolation that would become a defining theme of the novel Mary had yet to even imagine. Life back in England wasn't the romance they'd imagined. It was a chaotic mess of debt, secrets, and a simmering, deeply weird love triangle. The household now consisted of Mary, Percy, and Claire, and it was anything but simple. Friends of the poet would joke about Shelley and his 2 wives. Claire Clairmont wasn't just a tag-along, she was an active and often disruptive force. She had fully embraced Percy's free love ideas, maybe even more than Mary had, and seemed to enjoy her spot in the triangle. It's widely speculated her relationship with Percy wasn't entirely platonic, creating a constant undercurrent of rivalry with her stepsister. While Mary was deeply in love with Percy, she was also possessive and felt deeply insecure in this crowded union. The high-minded ideals they championed were starting to crash against the messy reality of human emotion. Percy, ever the idealist, wrote that true love, unlike gold and clay, doesn't shrink when it's divided. Easy for him to say. For Mary, it meant sharing the man she loved with the very real presence of her own stepsister under the same roof. It was a constant source of turmoil. Looking for her own spotlight, Claire set her sights on an even bigger prize, the most famous and infamous poet of the age, Lord Byron. Mad, bad, and dangerous to know, Byron was the ultimate celebrity rebel. Claire began a relentless pursuit, and in the spring of 1816, it worked. She had a brief, consequential affair with him in London. So when Byron, fleeing his own scandals, decided to summer in Switzerland, Claire saw her chance. She persuaded Mary and Percy to go with her, desperately hoping to rekindle things with Byron. She was already pregnant with his child, which added a whole new layer of desperation to her plan. So in May of 1816, this tangled group of lovers and dreamers made their way to Lake Geneva. Percy and Mary, with their infant son William, rented a small house on the shore. Lord Byron, along with his personal doctor, John Polidori, leased the grander Villa Diodati nearby. The stage was set for a summer that would go down in literary history, a summer of creative genius fueled by romantic jealousy, intellectual fire, and some truly apocalyptic weather. They had no idea the storms gathering over the lake were nothing compared to the storm of creation about to be unleashed. The summer of 1816 wasn't a normal summer. It became known as the year without a summer. The year before, the massive eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia had spewed millions of tons of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, creating a global climate disaster. Europe was plunged into a dreary, cold, and relentlessly wet season. The sun was blotted out, and torrential rain kept the group of writers trapped indoors for days at a time. Confined to the Villa Diodati, they passed the time with intense conversations about philosophy, poetry, and the latest scientific breakthroughs. They talked about galvanism, the shocking new experiments where scientists used electricity to make the limbs of dead frogs twitch, creating the illusion of life. They talked about the occult, about the very nature of existence. The atmosphere was charged, both by the literal lightning flashing over the lake and the intellectual electricity inside the villa. The personal dynamics were just as stormy. Byron quickly grew tired of Claire, treating her with a dismissive cruelty that made everyone uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Byron's doctor, Polidori, developed a hopeless crush on Mary, adding yet another layer of tension. Rumors swirled in the nearby villages of orgies and debauchery at the villa, with locals allegedly setting up telescopes to spy on the scandalous English visitors. The group was totally isolated, trapped together by the rain and their own complicated feelings. One dark and stormy night, no, really, Byron proposed a challenge to pass the time. They should each write a ghost story. Byron wrote a fragment about a vampire, which Polidori would later develop into The Vampire, a story that basically created the modern vampire genre. Percy Shelley started his own story. But Mary? At first, she drew a blank. She felt a mortifying pressure to come up with something worthy of the brilliant men surrounding her. For days, she struggled. Then, one night, after another late-night discussion about reanimating corpses, she went to bed. But she couldn't sleep. Her imagination, she later wrote, possessed her. She fell into a waking dream, a vivid and terrifying vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together, she would recall. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. She saw it all. The creator, horrified by what he'd made, abandoning it in disgust. She had found her story. The next day, she started writing what she thought would be a short tale. But with Percy's encouragement, the story grew and grew. The seed of Frankenstein had been planted, born from sleepless nights, scientific speculation, and the monstrous tangle of their shared lives. As Mary expanded her ghost story into a novel, the themes of creation and abandonment from her waking dream began to play out in her own life with horrifying symmetry. The story she was writing became an uncanny mirror of her deepest anxieties and the emotional chaos that surrounded her. The theme of a monstrous creation was deeply personal. Mary's own birth had caused her mother's death, a fact that haunted her. She had also created life herself, only to watch it be extinguished. Her first child, with Percy, a premature daughter, had died just days after her birth in 1815. Mary's journal from that time is heartbreaking. Dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it by the fire, and it lived. I awake and find no baby. That desperate wish to reverse death became Victor Frankenstein's central obsession. Many scholars now read Victor's horrified rejection of his creation as a dark reflection of postpartum trauma and the terror of parental responsibility. Soon after they returned to England, tragedy struck again and again. In October 1816, Mary's half-sister, Fanny Imlay, who had also been in love with Percy, committed suicide with an overdose of laudanum. Fearing scandal, the family hushed it up. Just 2 months later, another body was found. Percy Shelley's first wife, Harriet, drowned herself in a London lake. She was pregnant with another man's child, having been abandoned by Percy years earlier. The two suicides left a dark stain on their lives. Though Harriet's death meant Percy was legally free to marry Mary, which they did just weeks later, it also cemented their reputation as a destructive force. Mary was writing the first chapters of Frankenstein in the immediate aftermath of her sister's suicide. The novel is soaked in this loss and isolation. The creature's profound loneliness, his desperate yearning for a companion, and his rage at being abandoned by his creator. It all echoes Mary's own feelings of being an outcast, her grief, and her isolation within her own family. When the creature cries, "I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me," it's the voice of Mary herself, a woman shunned by society, betrayed by her father, and surrounded by death. The novel is a tapestry of her pain. Victor Frankenstein is the neglectful parent who flees responsibility, much like Percy often fled his duties. The creature is the abandoned child, a composite of all the lonely souls in Mary's life. Her motherless self, her dead infant daughter, and her spurned sister, Fanny. Frankenstein was the vessel where she poured all her grief, guilt, and disillusionment with the radical ideals that had promised freedom, but delivered so much sorrow. Every great work of art has a story, but few are as dramatic and tragic as the one that gave us Frankenstein. If you found this dive into the dark side of the Romantic era compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon for more stories about the messy lives behind the masterpieces. And let us know in the comments, who do you think is the true monster in this story? The creator, the creature, or the circumstances that brought them both to life? Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, was published anonymously on January 1st, 1818. Mary Shelley was just 20 years old. At first, many reviewers assumed it were written by her more famous husband, Percy. But the novel's power was undeniable. It was a new kind of story, a Gothic horror that was also a profound philosophical exploration of science, morality, and what it means to be human. The tragedies didn't stop there. Mary and Percy moved to Italy, but their life was marred by the deaths of 2 more of their children, Clara and William. The losses plunged Mary into a deep depression. Then, in 1822, Percy Shelley himself drowned in a storm at sea, leaving Mary a widow at just 24 years old. She returned to England with her one surviving child, Percy Florence, and dedicated her life to raising him and cementing her late husband's literary legacy. but it was her own creation. The monstrous and heartbreaking tale conceived in that storm-tossed Swiss villa that would grant her immortality. Frankenstein was born from a perfect storm, a young woman of incredible intellect, steeped in the radical ideas of her famous parents. A scandalous romance built on a free love philosophy that proved disastrous, a tangled web of jealousy with her own stepsister, and a relentless series of tragedies that gave her an intimate understanding of creation and abandonment. Mary Shelley took the pain of her life, the absence of a mother, the death of her children, the rejection by her father, the loneliness of an outcast, and transformed it into a timeless work of art. She created a monster, and in doing so she gave a voice to the abandoned and misunderstood everywhere, ensuring that her story and his would never be forgotten.